Welcome to Between the Lines. I'm your host, Lou Palumbo. As usual, we have no shortage of things to talk about. Let me remind you why we're doing this. It's very simple. It's for our children and the future of this country. We're here to find solutions to some of the heavy lifting issues and problems facing the country today. On today's show, we're going to have a gentleman by the name of Tom Basile. Tom is a Newsmax TV host, Washington Times columnist, and an author. I have a few questions for Tom. They're going to revolve around gun control, crime in our major cities, the borders, this issue with Texas, and how they're posturing with the federal government. And we're going to discuss Governor Cuomo and his departure as governor of the state of New York. So I thank you for joining us today. And I encourage you to go onto our website at betweenthelines.tv. Without further ado, I want to thank Tom. I want to introduce you to him, and we're going to start this little exchange. So, Tom, thank you for joining me today. I cannot tell you in words how much I appreciate it and how much respect I have for you based on your accomplishments.
Lou, thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate it. I do have to correct one thing. I'm a columnist for the Washington Times. Somebody who has my views probably would not be accepted by the Washington Post. Very different ideological bent.
I understand that, and I apologize.
No, it's all right.
Because I do know the difference.
Yeah.
So, in any case, you and I have spoken, and we are very like-minded. I would say that we're conservative in many of our views. We're gravely concerned for the future of our children in this country. The destiny is somewhat distressing as what we're living in today. And there's no shortage of things we're going to be able to discuss today. One of the first things I do want to talk to you about is we're going to get right into the governor, if I may. This has been a rather interesting experience with Governor Cuomo, who finally, I guess through divine intervention, has realized he's had to step down as opposed to continuing to impugn the character and credibility of 11 young women. So, I'm curious to hear what you feel the impact of this is going to be on the state to begin with, Tom.
Well, sure. I was the executive director of the state Republican Party when Spitzer resigned and Patterson then took over. Patterson then had his scandals and then decided not to run for re-election. And then we got Prince Andrew, as I've been calling him, and I also call him Fredo's brother. And so, New Yorkers have been through the ringer. Think about it. 3 of the last 4 governors have either resigned in disgrace or left office because of scandal. And I'm glad that he has chosen to resign. I don't think that his beating up on these women is going to stop. I think that he is going to be facing some charges. He's going to be facing civil and potentially criminal cases in which he's going to mount a very, very fierce defense. He has already attacked them. He has attacked the investigation, and New Yorkers are tired. They're being taxed out of their homes. They see political corruption is the calling card of Albany, and they're looking for something different. Now, the big question is, Kathy Hochul will become the governor. She's going to be the first woman governor in New York. She ran as a moderate. She's known for being a moderate. She's an upstate Western New Yorker who is the county clerk of Erie County and a one-term congresswoman who ran with the NRA's support at one point. But the ascension of the socialist wing of the Democratic Party out of the city of New York in particular is very, very strong.
I have a quick question for you. Yeah. You ready?
Yeah.
Are you considering running yourself?
No, I'm not. I have run for office. I'm an elected official in the Hudson Valley. I'm finishing out my term. And Lou, I am very fortunate to have my show on Newsmax Television America right now, and to have to be able to project my voice across the country. And that is, as somebody who served in government at the local, state, and the federal level, now I think that is the best way for me to serve.
Well, you see, and I don't mean to
do what you're doing, to project some common sense into this national conversation.
But you see, the thing that's different between the two of us, Tom, is that you have a good shelf life ahead of you. And perhaps if I were younger, I would entertain politics. But you see, we need good young men like you, progressively thinking, that would represent some balance and some direction in this state in particular, that's going awry. I do want to tell you something interesting that you touched on. It has to do with taxation. The state of New York is following right in the footsteps of the state of California. And there's no secret, we're already experiencing a departure of many people from the city and state of New York. And I think people should anticipate that to increase. But I wasn't trying to flatter you, Tom, or patronize you. I really think it's something you should consider. You've already alluded to the fact that you have a lot of experience under your belt. So, I'm not telling you I'm going to come in and run your campaign or anything or handle your security, but I think it's something you might entertain. You present yourself well and you're intelligent in your views, and I think you are a problem solver, which is what's lacking today. But
well, I appreciate you. I appreciate you saying that. And but in the here and now, what really remains to be seen is what kind of leader Kathy Hochul will be. I think she has the opportunity to engender a lot of goodwill as the first woman governor of the state. But she's going to have to demonstrate, I think, for her to be successful and not just manage the same decline that you're talking about, Lou. She's going to have to be able to have the courage to be a problem solver and to not just kowtow to the socialist wing of the party. And we don't know whether or not she is going to be able to, to look at the middle class in the state of New York and say, we get it. I understand. You're literally being taxed out of your homes. You are fleeing. To say to the wealthy and business owners, I get it. I understand. You're leaving the state. You're taking your assets and your jobs with you. We're going to really help rein in this corruption, and we're going to make this state hospitable for people to live and work and raise a family in again. And we just don't know what she's going to be able to do. We do think that she's going to be primaried from the left, and the far left has had some success in electing people who are outside the mainstream of our politics, and therefore have an outsized role in policymaking. So I, for one, am very glad that Andrew Cuomo is going to be departing the stage. And I think that there is an opportunity to have some stability and maybe a course correction in Albany. But with a far left legislature, it's going to be very difficult.
We're going to take a quick break, Tom, and we're going to come back to this. And I'm sure that you saw the press conference from the Albany County Sheriff, which was quite impressive. And we're going to speak very briefly to potential criminal charges here, and something that's quite troubling to me, that putting your hand on the blouse of a woman and touching her breasts is not a felony. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be right back. We're going to take a quick break. I want to thank our sponsors, and I want to remind you, you can find us at betweenthelines.tv. You can view shows, you can find news, you can participate if you so choose by leaving questions, and I would encourage you to do so. We're going to be right back with Mr. Basile. Instacart, another interesting concept. You can go to your favorite grocery stores, sign on to their application without leaving your home, the comfort of your home. Just pick out the items you'd like. They'll assign a personal shopper for you and deliver them to the point that you would like them delivered to. Another great concept, very user-friendly, and I'll be honest, we use it also. It's very effective, and they're very, very good. They're very on point. We're back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm with Tom Basile, who is currently a Newsmax journalist, an author, and who is a columnist for the Washington Times. I was corrected earlier because I did make a big faux pas, not to confuse both of these journalistic avenues, because they are in complete opposition. But I want to welcome Tom back. We were just discussing the departure of the current governor, Andrew Cuomo, and I did want to just have a quick discussion with Tom about seeing the press conference and what he gleaned from the sheriff of the county of Albany. Tom, I give you the floor.
Sure. Look, I thought that it was very significant that one of these women did come forward to file a criminal complaint. The sheriff said that he felt when he was asked, "Why do you think she came forward?" He said, "Well, yeah, maybe she has seen that other people have put their name out there, that they've been willing to stick their necks out, frankly, to go after the governor for his impropriety, and that gave this individual some courage." And he said that it will be a criminal investigation, and it will be handled as if it were any other citizen. Nobody is above the law, and that we're at the early stages of that. So we will see what becomes of it. I have no doubt that Andrew Cuomo and his attorneys, because sheriffs are elected, that he will try to say that this is some sort of a political prosecution. But and I also think that there could be a lot more that could come out about either different potential victims or other details that we still haven't heard yet as this advances.
Well, there are going to be details. You're right about that. But there's something I observed in that press conference, Tom, that I thought was rather interesting. And that was the reference to the complainant as a victim. In other words, when he spoke in the press conference, he didn't refer to her as a complainant. He referred to her as a victim, which lends itself potentially to a state of mind. It might have been some type of subliminal slip, for example.
Yes.
I'm pretty certain that the sheriff's office is somewhat immersed in this investigation already. And my personal opinion is it's highly likely we're going to see a criminal prosecution. But as I mentioned to you earlier before the break, Tom, one of the things that's troubling me, and you and I both know they're going to charge him with potentially with assault and battery and any number of other charges, but the fact that we trivialize, and I want to explain why I use this term, when a woman has a man put his hand under her blouse and fondle her breast, that this is a misdemeanor. This should be a felony. This all lends itself again to a lot of the patronization that's going on with our women today. We give them the Me Too movement and Time's Up movement. When we're going to start to bite into this problem of how people should be held accountable when they cross lines with them. But I'm pretty sure you observed the same thing I did in regards to the press conference. And it sounds as though the groundwork is being laid. I do want to move on to something, Tom, that is very, very important and pressing in the country today. And there's quite a few issues, but this one deals with the crime in our major cities. Last weekend, we had 73 people shot in Chicago. That's right. What I find interesting about this is that every Monday, I guess we sit and wait to get the statistics across the country of all the shootings taking place or occurring in our major cities. The funny part of this discussion is I'm not hearing any solutions from any of the people that are running these cities. Right. And I say this to everyone so we don't get political here. I'm not attached to this politically. This has nothing to do if you're a Democrat or Republican. I just simply ask the public, independent of what you and I may say today or any other media outlets, look at who's running your major cities. Right. And be guided accordingly, because that's the direction the country's going in many regards. So I'm curious to hear what your take is on our conditions in our cities, and you can speak to any one or all of them. And we are going to speak to New York specifically. But go ahead, Tom.
Lou, and you know this from your background in law enforcement. We don't have a gun problem, which is the favorite line of the leftists who are running a lot of these cities. We have a criminal problem, and we also have 50 years of failed social welfare policy, which incidentally, the Democrats in Washington with this $3.5 trillion spending spree are about to put on steroids. It's going to be the biggest expansion of welfare potentially since the so-called Great Society programs of the late 1960s. They're going to double down on failure here. And there isn't one Democrat I have found, Lori Lightfoot certainly not Comrade de Blasio in New York, who have stepped up and said, what we have been doing hasn't worked. We have conned the public into believing that if we just spent another $1 billion on education, or we put another $1 billion into public housing, or we put another $1 billion into solving homelessness, or whatever it happens to be, that it's going to solve the problem. And it clearly hasn't. And we have a humanitarian crisis on our hands, not only at the southern border, we talk about that all the time, but within our cities. And what I always ask myself is, why isn't Joe Biden, who supposedly cares about communities of color, why isn't Joe Biden talking about the 8,000 Black homicides last year? Why don't Democrats like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer talk about these deaths? Every single one of them is a tragedy. Most of them could have been prevented. And it's all because of politics. They want this welfare expansion. They want to double down on a command and control style approach to governance, where we give the Black and brown communities, we throw them a few bones, we say we're going to give them more free this and free that and free programming, and it's going to solve the problem or make it better. And there is no empirical evidence to suggest that any of these things have worked or will work in the future, and they don't want to admit it. They want to demonize conservatives and Republicans. They want to demonize Second Amendment advocates, because they just don't have the guts to stand up and say, we need to be looking at different solutions here.
You know, Tom, I agree with everything that you said. Interestingly enough, the one thing that's I find rather disconcerting is the fact that they misrepresent the truth regarding the gun issue. The problem in the country is there's a lack of enforcement. We have plenty of gun laws. And as you and I both know, we've skipped along and crime has peaked and subsided based on enforcement. What we're lacking today is enforcement, and that lies in the will of the elected official. The police are only as effective as the elected officials will empower them to be. But, you know, my question to the public is, when is the light going to go on? Because I may have told you this in conversation, but I was born in Brooklyn in Bedford-Stuyvesant. I was the only white kid on the block. All my friends were Black. That was pretty much my journey till I went to college at St. John's. Then I was introduced to more of a, I guess, people alike to me. But the point I'm trying to make is that between growing up there and working in minority neighborhoods, the vast majority of the people in these neighborhoods are good people, and they're just looking for daylight.
Absolutely.
I could not imagine what it's like sitting in a minority neighborhood, concerned that your children's going to go out into the street to play, exactly, Tom, or have him sit next to a window adjacent to the street and worry about your son, you know, or daughter being shot. So,
and what the Democrats do, Lou, is they use that anxiety that you so correctly point out that exists within these communities where they're on edge. And they want them to turn that anxiety toward hatred and resentment. And that's one of the reasons why you're hearing so much about this supposedly systemic racism, white supremacism narrative that is being driven from the White House on down. Because again, it's about deflecting blame for this. They want people to be angry. They want to advance this victimhood culture so that government can continue to expand. And it's not about helping anybody. It's not about saving any lives. That's why these things, when you look at the war on cops, when you look at the war on cops, when you look at the state of our education environment, when you look at the Soros DAs all across the country, and New York City is about to get a DA that has already said that there are dozens and dozens of violations and crimes that he's just not even going to prosecute. When you look at all of those things and the systemic racism narrative and the welfare expansion and the basic income push from Bernie Sanders, it is all connected. It is all connected. And at the end of the day, freedom suffers, and real people suffer. Lives are lost as a result of it. And that's the insidious part of all of this.
You know, Tom, I have to say, I agree completely with you. One of the things I do want to do is touch upon solutions to these problems, which are things that we're not really addressing. We're going to take a break, ladies and gentlemen. I do want to thank our sponsors. I do encourage you to go to our betweenthelines.tv and you can listen to some more shows and participate in whatever way is most comfortable for you. We're going to be right back with Mr. Basili, and this is a rather insightful discussion, and really, if you listen to it carefully, there's an interesting word that applies here that I use on a frequent basis. It's called pandering, and that's what we have going on here. So we're going to be right back, ladies and gentlemen, and you're going to find this conversation to continue to be quite interesting. We'll be right back. So let me tell you a little bit about Buzzsprout. Very interesting concept. Basically, it allows you to set up your own podcast. One of the most advantageous things about using Buzzsprout is it's user-friendly. So I encourage you highly, if your inclination is to create your own podcast, please look into Buzzsprout. And by the way, we use it. We're back, and we're with a gentleman by the name of Tom Basile, Washington Times columnist, an author in his own right, and Newsmax TV journalist. And I do want to thank him again, the information and his wealth of knowledge as to these aren't really intricate problems. They're rather transparent if you really think about it. Sometimes about seeing the forest for the trees. But we're going to get back into this conversation about the cities, the condition of the cities, and political agenda, which I think is what's driving this whole narrative and the optic today in the country. So we were talking about the cities, Tom, and this agenda of one of our political parties. I guess it's an attempt to continue to endear them to the political affiliation for the purpose of voting. I mean, that seems to be what the MO is, whether it's in our inner cities or even our borders, Tom, you know. And I do want to say one thing about the Republican Party. At some point, they've got to, I would believe, soften or modify their approach to the immigration issue and start to consider amnesty for people who may have been here, say, for generations, which we have, interestingly enough. We've had people here 15, 20, 25, 30 years. If they were so important to get out of the country, we should have got off the stick a long time ago, Tom. There's got to be some, I would say, compromise, which is the word that's lacking in our conversations today, in addressing that. But I do want to go back to the cities, and what's so interesting is that I don't see anyone, to be very candid with you, doing anything to create some type of parity in the minority community. And my opinion is it's going to cost a lot of money and bodies. One thing I learned about the city of New York, they fix problems by throwing money and bodies at it. Well, this is a perfect scenario. I think we have to go back and take these cities back a block at a time. I do want to ask you this question to get your opinion. I guess you were around for January 6th of this year, right? The Great Siege and what followed, right? We deployed tens of thousands of National Guardsmen into Washington, D.C. Am I correct, Tom?
Yes,
I guess we had some people that were fearful for their safety. Is there any reason why we're not employing that tactic in other major cities, especially those riddled with shootings, to prevent and deter, which is the whole purpose of uniform policing? Is there a reason we're not going down this road, Tom?
Remember last year when President Trump, offered to provide federal law enforcement and the military to the mayors of Democrat cities that were literally being burned to the ground, and they were doing nothing about it. And he was called a racist. Nancy Pelosi called our troops stormtroopers. But of course, the elitists in Washington who are against a border wall, they threw up walls, and they had troops sleeping in the Capitol, and they had no compunction about doing that. And by the way, while all those troops were in D.C. protecting the Capitol building and protecting members of Congress, the shootings in Washington, D.C. went up
through the roof. Yeah. Yep.
Because the people, the real people in the communities that are dealing with the violence that we're seeing, they're still dealing with it. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden didn't give a hoot about any of those folks, and that's a real. I wrote a column earlier in the year about turning Capitol Hill into the Forbidden City in Beijing. What we call America's Forbidden City is the way that I framed it. And when you look at the way authoritarians, when you look at the way Marxists and socialists sort of think about themselves, they all have some very similar characteristics. And we see that in the way that they respond to these crises. They're gobbling up resources for themselves, but at the same time, they're not willing to use them to help real people. And again, the Democratic Party they have committed themselves to this war on cops. They did it all through last year, and it still continues. And we're going to have a very significant problem with police shortages and with rising crime until police officers feel like they have the backing of the politicians. It doesn't, when you have a city like New York that abrogates qualified immunity and thinks that is somehow going to help Black and brown communities, that is somehow going to help the economy, that it's somehow going to save lives, it is absolutely counterintuitive and just insane. While at the same time, what do they want to do? They want to grow government in other places that are not only at arm's length from the people that need the most help, but really haven't demonstrated the ability to help them to begin with.
Yeah, I can't help but not agree with you, Tom. I mean, it's almost troubling. It's troubling what they're not doing, but what's even more troubling is the fact that this country is not speaking to it. I've not heard any news affiliate, regardless of them, speak to this issue about deployment of the National Guard for the purpose of Washington, D.C. and their sensitives and the rest of this country. You know, I do want to just mention quite briefly, because I don't like to be too contentious, this thing with Cori Bush. I don't even know where to begin with this. I guess she's entitled to buy people like myself from current or former law enforcement agents who are armed to protect her. But we shouldn't pay people the same way she's paying people to protect you. I'm missing something here along the way with this discussion. But I do want to say
common sense. Yeah,
it's frightening. But you know what? I do want to thank her for being around, because, you know, and I am quite liberal in a lot of my positions, Tom. You'd be shocked. Your safety is not something that's negotiable with me. I am encouraged by people like Cori Bush and Tlaib and Omar, AOC, Beto O'Rourke, Julian Castro, Buttigieg, and even our vice president, that our 2022 midterms are going to swing in the right direction, because if they don't, this is going to be our litmus test. And everything we get after that, we're going to probably deserve. But your take on Miss Bush?
Well, look, this is the, do as I say, not as I do hypocrisy that you see from the far left all the time. People tolerated Andrew Cuomo. We started off talking about Andrew Cuomo in the first segment. If Andrew Cuomo were a Republican, he would have been run out of town in 10 minutes. There would have been absolutely no tolerance for somebody who behaves the way he behaves, with the number of scandals that he has. Look at Obama's a birthday party on his private island or whatever the heck it was. A bunch of maskless elitists flying in on their carbon spewing private jets, but kids are going to have to go back to school in masks in a lot of places in this country. It's Nancy Pelosi, who lives behind a wall with lots of private security. But when we talk about putting up border protections, common sense border protections to help our border patrol, that the border patrol wants, we can't do that. That's racist. That's xenophobic. And the leftist hypocrisy, I always say, Lou, I think that people generally in this country are a lot smarter than the politicians and the left-wing media give them credit for.
I hope you're right about that, Tom. That statement you just made, I hope you're right about that.
And hey, look, remember, 4 years of Carter gave us 2 terms of Reagan. And as I've said on the air on my show before and on other Newsmax shows, we have to put out those solutions. We have to double down on the formula for American greatness, but we also have to remember that we have to keep things in perspective. We've been here before, and we've seen urban decay before. I mean, you remember New York of the 1970s. It did get to a point, unfortunately, because we tend to do things very slowly in this country. But you remember New York of the 1970s. That did ultimately lead to a renaissance. And there is a historical and political and policy pendulum that does tend to swing. And I think that if Republicans and conservatives and moderates and conservative Democrats, if there are any of them left, really take a look at what's going on in this country, they will swing the pendulum back in 2022. The other thing, Lou, that I want to point out, and I think this is so important for people because they're inundated with bad news, is that Justice Brandeis said that the states are the laboratories for democracy, and he was right. And there's a lot of good stuff that's going on. Washington is a disaster, but there's a lot of good stuff that's actually going on in state legislatures because they're looking at the direction of Washington, at the direction of states like New York and California and Illinois. And they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we protect our citizens? How do we prevent this from happening to us? We're seeing it on policing. We're seeing it on critical race theory. We're seeing it on things like ballot harvesting and Mark Zuckerberg putting tens of millions of dollars into elections to try and influence elections and things like that. So there's a lot that is actually happening kind of under the radar of the CNNs and the MSLSDs of the world. And it's important for people to realize that we are starting to see a pushback against some of this stuff.
We're going to take a quick break, Tom, and I'm going to come back and speak very briefly to the cities that you alluded to in the 1970s, and then we're going to speak about the border. And I do want to have a conversation with you about Texas and how they're taking their posture and what's going to be the exchange between the federal government and Texas. We'll be right back, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to thank our sponsors. I would encourage you to go to our website at betweenthelines.tv. We have with us today a gentleman, Tom Basile. I would say he's quite distinguished, highly intelligent, articulate, and he probably should run for office again. I'm going to work him on this one, but we're going to be right back, guys. Okay, we're back, and with me is gentleman Tom Basile. Mr. Basile happens to be a Newsmax journalist and author, and to say this correctly again for the third time, a columnist with the Washington Times. We've been discussing the condition of our cities, and I want to continue this discussion because Tom brought up a very interesting point about the 1970s and the 80s, by the way, that existed, and the fact that we did usher in a renaissance, but there's something different happening here, and I just want to speak to that quite quickly with you, Tom. Mm-hmm. In the 1970s, the crime went through the roof. We had the resolve of the police to go out and address it. That's gone. That left the conversation. Right. And you discussed some of the reasons why. The immunity, loss of pension, potential incarceration, trying to do your job. And the other thing that's happened in the city, and this is something people do not understand who didn't live in 93 when Giuliani was sworn in and Bill Bratton, the most progressive and highly intelligent police administrator we've had, the demographic in the city was different. We have more of a demographic that is democratically minded, which is why we don't even put up a decent Republican candidate. And I mean no sliding to Curtis Sliwa. He just doesn't have the resume to run this city. I don't know how you run a city like New York with the ethnic and religious and cultural diversity that it has and have anybody be happy at the end of the day. But I did just want to mention that, Tom. The problem we're facing today is these cops aren't going to go back out and engage the way they did in the 70s and 80s because there's no support or so backing. But listen, I do want to talk to you about the borders, but I want to talk to you first about what's going on in Texas, which is quite interesting. Sure. You and I both know the governor came out. Since the federal government will not regulate, control their border, they've decided to do so. They identified the fact they're going to have private land donated to them, correct, Tom, and funding, and deploy the National Guard, and they're going to incarcerate the people that violate our borders, which is a criminal act, I remind everyone, not catch and release them. The response by the federal government at the notion that the governor of that state would protect its residents and citizens is we're challenging you. Now, here's the question. Who prevails in this instance? We have a constitutional battle coming our way, I believe, and I certainly hope the governor, who's their head of state, right, prevails in this instance because it's quite apparent, as you and I are discussing, there's absolutely no resolve on the side of the federal government to address this. And I have to tell you something else that's interesting. I watch CBS in the morning, primarily because Commissioner Bratton's wife, Ricky Kleeman, and they're both friends of mine, does legal segments. And yesterday, they gave it a lot of appropriate airtime, speaking to the condition of this border. They then followed up with the mayor of McLaren, Texas, as you've probably seen, speaking to the fact that they had 7,000 migrants come into their state, COVID positive, since the beginning of the year, and 1,500 in the past week. I go back and ask you, is the public sleeping here, or are we just too damn distracted by our iPhones, your cars you're driving, your new watch? I mean, what's the problem here? Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we're going to see it in 2022, Tom.
Well, look, I was in Texas 2 weeks ago, and people down in Texas and in places like Arizona are not sleeping. I do encourage everybody else to wake up, because people they're coming across the border, but they're not staying at the border. Well, part of the Biden administration, part of the Biden administration's policy is to give these folks a free bus ticket and a free plane ticket wherever they want to go. They are actually also busing them themselves into the interior of the United States. They're going to places like North Carolina and Tennessee. When Obama did this, they ended up in about 20 states. I would assume that these folks will end up in even more places. Look, I think that what Governor Abbott is doing is spot on. I applaud the other governors for sending law enforcement assets. I think there are 4 or 5 governors.
Oh, there's more than that, Tom. There's more than that. There's more than half a dozen. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're sending law enforcement assets to Texas to help. I think that that's absolutely correct. I've also advocated, and I think it's very important, for the state legislatures in these states to pass resolutions saying that they will not accept illegals from when the federal government tries to resettle illegal immigrants into their states. And I think that these states that are getting these folks, they should pass a law that says that they will not, and they're going to have to fight that in court as well. But the states themselves need to step up. And I'm very glad that Texas is doing that. They need to appropriate money. They need to start building a border wall as soon as the courts will allow them to do it. And they need to start incarcerating people.
Tom, I do want to say one thing so everyone's clear about something. You and I are not anti-immigrant. What we're lacking here, exactly, there has to be a mechanism in place. In other words, the country's built off immigrants. I spoke to you early before we got rolling here. My mother's and my father's parents came through Ellis Island. This is not about anti-immigrant, but there's got to be a mechanism in place that does this in an orderly fashion. Not that it's done as it's a free-for-all, which is what's going on in the borders. And what I find interesting, and I just want to mention this very quickly, that certain media outlets, I'll let people figure it out on their own, are intentionally deceiving their viewership as to not to convey to them the extreme condition we're dealing with at the border. I'm trying to put my arms around that. We're talking about our children wearing masks, which I'm not a fan of, because I don't believe it's good for them to rebreathe their CO2 when the respiratory systems are in development, right? But we're concerned about the virus, but not so much when we have people infiltrating the country who are rampant with it. This is just like it's becoming like the funny farm here.
Well, it's more liberal hypocrisy. Look, the Biden administration, Kamala Harris says, well, the border was broken to begin with, and we were telling people not to come. They shouldn't come. We are giving people, if they cross the border, they're getting free housing, free food, free clothes, free education, free health care, a free bus or plane ticket anywhere that they want to go. They were immediately put into the social welfare complex that you and I were talking about. That is the Democrats' primary agenda item is to expand that social welfare complex. They are immediately put into that. 70% of them will never get out of that social welfare complex. And people like you and I and folks who pay taxes of all political stripes, of all races, creeds, and colors, they're the ones who are paying for it. Meanwhile, we've got a national catastrophe going on with thousands of people dying in the streets in our cities. We have gangs. We have a government-run education system that is failing, particularly communities of color, but people all across America. And it is absolutely ridiculous that we're allowing these folks to come in, and it's going to be about 2 million. So, Lou, if it continues the way that it's going now, more people than the population of a dozen states will come into the United States illegally this year because of the Biden administration, and the Democrats look the other way because ultimately they want to get these folks into the system. They don't give a crap about them having the American dream. They want to make them dependent. They want to become part of the dependency class, and then ultimately register them Democrat.
Tom, I want to just say something else, if I may. You know what I find interesting with this issue with Texas is basically the governor kind of thumbed his nose up to the government, said, if you won't fix the wall, we will. We're going to regulate and control this intelligently. Yeah. And the federal government asserted their supremacy on this issue. What I find interesting is that when we had states growing marijuana for medicinal purposes and for recreational, which, by the way, marijuana is still a controlled substance, a Schedule I controlled substance with DEA. Where was the federal government to come in?
And it's not medicine.
Well, okay. Where was the federal government then? I'm just curious. So if you want to protect your state, we have an issue with you. If you want to grow marijuana for recreational use, which most people need to wrap their arms around, the fact that we don't need any more substances that departs us from our senses. Where were you then? How come you didn't come in and assert yourself? But I got a bigger question. So let's say hypothetically, the governor puts up the wall independent of what the judge rules or the federal government says. What are we going to do? Send federal troops and tear it down? This is my question. Why aren't they? You understand where we're going with this today?
I think that these states should really be pushing the envelope. I think they should be putting these walls on private property if they need to. And they really should be pushing the envelope. They should show the public that Washington, particularly this administration, has absolutely no, regardless of what they say, absolutely no interest in solving this problem because it suits their political and policy agenda purposes. And when it comes to the marijuana issue, those states also had big tobacco dumping millions and tens of millions and billions of dollars into an addiction for profit industry that they wanted to grow, and the states were allowed to be bought off. That's how you got medical marijuana and legalized what they call recreational marijuana, which is just high potency THC products that can fry the brain of pretty much any individual if you take enough of it.
Tom, let me run to a quick break, if I may,
yeah, sure.
And then I want to come back. And I do want to ask you your opinion as what a potential solution is with this whole border issue. We're going to be right back, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank Mr. Basili for joining us today. I want to thank our sponsors, Instacart and Buzzsprout. I want to thank Spotify and Apple. I want to thank everybody that's supported this exercise. I encourage you to go to our website at betweenthelines.tv. We are interested in hearing from you. This is not about contention today. We're speaking to you factually and truthfully. You do not have to be spoon-fed by Tom Basile or myself, or for that matter, any media outlet. Go out and do your own independent investigation.
That's right.
It's going to horrify you what's standing before you and looking in your eyes. And we are not anti-immigrant. This is a topic that has to be intelligently regulated, like gun control, which we're going to get into in a little bit. We'll be right back, and thank you for joining us today. We'll be right back. We're back, and with us today is a gentleman by the name of Tom Basile. Tom is an author. He is a columnist for the Washington Times and a journalist on Newsmax TV. We've been discussing a myriad of topics, and we're going to continue to discuss this border issue. And I do want to ask, Tom, your approach to this border discussion. And then I do want to move on to gun control with you as well, sir.
Sure. First of all, we have to stop conflating the idea of political refugees and economic migrants. This is something that the left in this country has done very deliberately They want people to feel like these folks are fleeing political oppression, and so we need to bring them in. We need to take them in. That's not what's going on here. These are economic migrants. They are not, there are a percentage of them, a small percentage of them may be legitimate political refugees, but they are being told to apply for refugee status, even though they are clearly economic migrants. And you have to have one effective border infrastructure, and whether it's a wall, whether it's electronics, whether it's troops or border patrol on the border with significant force, you've got to have that infrastructure. And by the way, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, Barack Obama all said this in the early 2000s, that this was important, that we needed to have effective barriers along our southern border. They have now totally flipped their narrative there. So you need infrastructure, you need personnel, and then you also need to have limits. I think that what Trump did, and I agree with the former president on certain things. I disagreed with him. The Remain in Mexico policy was working. It was dissuading people from making the trip. It was keeping people back in their home countries. He was tying aid to the Northern Triangle countries to whether or not they kept their people in those countries. And I think that we need to go back to those policies. I think it's very, very clear. I also think that there are roles for states to play in this. And as I mentioned, I think that states need to start rejecting migrants that the federal government is bussing in and dropping off and telling their social services.
Can I just say one word here real quick?
People.
Cuba.
Yeah.
Cuba. People fleeing political oppression. The rules don't seem to apply to them. I mean,
yeah, they were told don't come.
I mean, this is, I don't even know what to say. And I know that we put up some window dressing with the vice president as to, don't come to the borders. That went in one ear and out the other. And I think, as you know, the elected officials, the leaders of these countries like Honduras, Guatemala came out and said, this is the byproduct of the Biden administration. That's the impetus to them fleeing to the border. And you alluded to the former president and his addressment at the border, where he leveraged Mexico into regulating its southern border to Honduras. Again, I go back and say that these things are staring us right in the eyes, Tom. I just don't even know where to go with this today.
Lou, and I want to bring up something else, and we've touched on this a couple of times in the conversation, and that is this concept of the American dream, which I also think is being warped by the left very intentionally to try and con people into thinking that we should have an open borders policy. When my grandparents came here from Italy, they came here legally. They had to have people come before them to make sure that they had a roof over their head, that they had income, that they were not going to become wards of the state, and they were expected to work, to learn English, and to create their own wealth. And there used to be a time in this country where people came here with 2 nickels and they went from poverty into the middle class in 1 generation. That's the American dream. That is not the American dream of Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders and AOC and Nancy Pelosi. These people that are coming across the border are going to become part of a new dependency class. They are going to be sucked into a government support system that most of them will never get out. We have a responsibility as Americans to protect the concept of the American dream. And we do that by saying, you know what, we're going to be a nation of immigrants, but we're going to make sure that the people who come here are going to have the best opportunity imaginable to be able to make it here on their own without the government giving them a check, paying for their housing, and giving them so-called free stuff at the expense of everybody else. And I think that's so key to the how the American mindset needs to approach this issue.
I tell you, Tom, I think to simplify this, I live by this word KISS, because I think that's one thing we moved away from. The agenda is quite clear. We're developing a voting base, really, and that's at the expense, I hate to say this, of the future of this country and on the backs of our children. I do want to say one thing, though, that I'm curious to get your take on it. My perception is that more and more prominent black leaders are figuring out the Democratic agenda, and they're starting to speak out about it. They realized in 1965 what we did was create another form of slavery. You know, we basically made them so dependent upon us. We enslaved them with the expectation that they would vote. And that's exactly what did transpire.
Yeah.
You know, I do want to say one thing, Tom. It's never my intention to become too political, but the truth has no political association. It's the truth. And I encourage people to go out and delve into this themselves. I want to take a quick break, Tom.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I want to finish your thought. Go ahead, sir.
No, and I want to, if you want to make this non-political, let's just say it. All right. Republicans are partly to blame because they have ignored communities of color because they weren't a voting base.
Absolutely correct,
and
sir.
Democrats have taken advantage of these folks, buying off their leaders and basically buying off their votes. And at the end of the day, you have a human crisis where you do have a new segregation. And it's despicable.
We're going to take a quick break, Tom. When we come back, we're gonna bump into this whole gun control issue, which is another issue that's mired in misinformation from the left. They just have this, I guess, compulsion to intentionally mislead the citizens of this country. We're going to take a quick break, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank our sponsors. I do encourage you, please go to our website at betweenthelines.tv. You can listen to shows past or present, and I encourage you to participate with emails. You may call in as well. And just to remind you, we have a gentleman with us today, Tom Basile, who is quite accomplished in his own right and is, I would say, volunteering some rather interesting insight as to the condition of this country on a number of issues. So we'll be right back, and thank you for joining us. We're back, ladies and gentlemen. With us today, we have Tom Basile, author, journalist, columnist for the Washington Times. You can find him on Newsmax TV, which I would encourage you to do. He provides quite a bit of interesting insight as to the problems that are nagging us today. And he and I are both of the same cloth. We don't want to overly politicize this. We're acknowledging that there is fault on both sides of this aisle. You know, just very quickly, Tom, the one thing with the immigration issue that I think the Republicans should consider, you know, they identify approximately 11 million illegal immigrants in the country. I think that we have to come to terms with the fact that they're an important part of our workforce, and we shouldn't necessarily give them citizenship. It was suggested by the president, maybe the second day into term, the eight-year path to citizenship. Let's just give them amnesty. Let your children vote. Let's get on with the show and start to control these borders responsibly. I don't think we can just totally ignore the fact that we need immigrants in the country. They seem to continue this work ethic that we're starting to move away from, that we touched upon at the very beginning of the show, the way we've spoiled our children, for example. But in any case, you want to comment on that, and then we'll go to gun control?
Yeah, you know, Lou, I think that the immigration issue, when it comes to Republicans and conservatives in this country, it's not a monolithic view. I think that's one of the things that the left-wing media and big tech like to, and the Democrats like to push, is that, oh, Republicans and conservatives, they're anti-immigrant, they don't want any of these, they want to kick all these people out, and that's just not the case. And I was at CPAC a couple of years ago, and they did a straw poll on the immigration issue, and some form of path to citizenship actually got a very substantial number of what is traditionally a much more conservative audience, because I think that people are smart enough to realize we're not kicking these people out. They're here, and we're not going to be able to. We're not sending them home. Many of these folks have become productive members of society. What we need to do is, in the here and now, start controlling this, and making sure that these folks, again, have the ability to achieve the American dream. So I don't think that it's a monolith. I think that that Americans given the fact that we are an incredibly generous country, and people understand that we're a nation of immigrants, that if folks are willing, if the Democrats are willing to have a serious debate that about what to do with the folks who are here and controlling the border, I think that you could get to a compromise. I don't know in this particular Congress with this president who's totally controlled by the far left, if you would, but I think that you'd have a lot of Republicans and conservatives take a much more common sense approach to it than the way that they're framed in the press.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tom. I want to talk to you about this gun control issue, and what I find interesting about it, once again, as I mentioned earlier, is this intentional exercise of misleading the public as to what's going on with the firearms issue in the country. Mm-hmm. We conveniently neglect to mention that the common denominator to every mass shooting is mental illness. We just kind of gloss over it. Mm-hmm. I think that we're failing to recognize the number of firearms that are in this country that on the conservative side are 400 million.
Right.
I think that we're conveniently neglecting the fact that between last year and I believe this year at June, we've had over 80 million NICS checks. That's a check to acquire at least one firearm. One NICS check, you could buy quite a number of firearms on, National Instant Criminal Background Check. I think they're ignoring the fact that we're having almost 10 million first-time gun buyers. This is not the climate to be talking about gun control, because obviously the public is unnerved. Their response in buying firearms supports that statement. So the question is, how do we approach this gun control issue? Because this is one in which we need compromise. We need an intelligent discussion, and I believe, not to be simplistic about this, but we need a mechanism that starts with addressing mentally and emotionally disturbed people from acquiring firearms, and then I think we kind of continue the conversation from there.
Well, sure.
The inconsistencies is that these assault rifles that they want to ban are public officials. They have the security details carrying them, and the public is asking, well, why can't I use them to protect my family? Is your safety more important than and it's a legitimate question, but I'm curious to get a little bit of your intake on this.
Well, I think, first of all, we've done a really poor job of having the different areas of law enforcement and these different databases communicate with each other. If you remember the Parkland student that was involved in that tragedy, the cops have been called to this kid's house dozens and dozens of times, and yet somehow there was no action that was taken. So I think that after 9/11, one of the things that I think we tried to do with our law enforcement and our federal law enforcement, our state and local, is to increase and break down barriers to communication, so that people could talk to each other better if we had another terrorist incident. I think that when it comes to mental health issues, when it comes to crime, when it comes to other issues, we're not doing that terribly effectively. But I want to go back to an issue of priorities, and I keep going back to this number. Yes, every single mass shooting by somebody who's dealing with who's mentally ill is a horrific tragedy. 8,000 people were killed on the streets of America in urban environments, mostly black on black or black on brown crime. Last year, 8,000 people. That's more people than died in the war in Iraq and 9/11 combined. It's happening every single year. Those people are not getting background checks. They're not legal gun owners. They're not necessarily mentally ill. We're having the wrong conversation. If we're really talking about saving lives, we're having the wrong conversation. And I don't think that when it comes to the Democrats who are saying, well, we need more gun laws, we need to get rid of AR-15s, and they're not interested in having the right conversation about this and actually saving lives. So I think that that's where we really should be starting. And one of the you said 400 million guns and 80 million new guns. Let's remember, a lot of the firearms that are in circulation in the United States, some of them are 50, 60, 70, 80 years old. Some of these guns have been in circulation, passed from gang member to gang member for decades. Those are not guns that are being sold at a gun shop yet tomorrow. No gangbanger walks into the gun shop to get a background check and then goes out and starts shooting up a street. That's what we need to be focused on. And the Biden administration is on the total opposite side of that. They want to talk about penalties for gun dealers who sell guns. They want to talk about assault rifles and things like that. It's the total wrong conversation to be had.
These are actually two separate conversations, Tom, too. You're correct. The one in which we're having all of these people murdered in our major cities, this is an enforcement issue. That's
right.
all there is to it. Simple.
Right.
The other issue about regulating access of these firearms is something that's a separate conversation that a compromise needs to be made on. But there's no compromise in addressing what's going on in the major cities. You need to dedicate the appropriate resources to put that condition under arrest, to use a word that's germane to law enforcement. Go ahead, Tom.
And here's the other thing, though, is that when we were talking about the DAs earlier, all right, you and I both know that one of the first things to get dropped in a plea bargain is the gun charge. And I have long advocated that that should be illegal, that states should prevent their district attorneys from dropping gun charges. The problem that you have, particularly in places like Illinois, New York, and California, and Washington State, and Oregon State, Washington, D.C., is that there is a strain within the Democratic Party today that says we are anti-incarceration. So if you've got people who have a mandatory, if there's going to be a mandatory gun charge, well, there's going to be jail time that comes with that. So it's not just about the policing, it's about state policy with respect to DAs, and it's also how the DAs run their offices.
Tom, you're familiar with the Sullivan Law, am I correct, sir? In the state of New York, mandatory year in jail if you're caught with an illegal concealed weapon. We don't even do that. You know what we didn't
we don't do? No, we totally ignore the Sullivan Law.
Well, that's it. But you know what we forgot to talk about today was bail reform under this governor. I don't know how that would slip through the crack. No. But you talk about what's hamstringing New York and New York City. Yeah. But listen, we're going to wrap it today, and I hope that you come back because these conversations are quite stimulating, and these are conversations the public needs to hear. And I go back and say, don't take us on our word. Go out and do your own investigating. You'll find out factually that this is what's going on, and hopefully that will influence your decision when you vote at the polls. And that's something that's critical at this point in 2022. I have never been anti-Democrat. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, I've actually voted for Democrats. I do say this to you today. It's an unrecognizable party. There's an undercurrent, and we are dealing with this extreme left, and I mentioned some of the players that are undermining their own efforts, which I don't have a problem with because the overall agenda of the Democratic Party is not one that's in the best interest of this country, and more importantly, not in the best interest of our children and the future of this country. So we're going to wrap it today. I want to thank Tom Basile for joining us today, and I hope that we can get you back on, Tom. We could keep talking about these topics for quite some time, but I think it's important that intelligent, responsible information is provided to the public so we can give you food for thought. That's what this is about. In any case, Tom, thank you so much, buddy, and I cannot thank you.
Real pleasure.
Yeah, it's my pleasure as well. And I'm going to ride you about office. You're a young horse. Let's get some mileage out of you, Tom. Okay, buddy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Lou.
Be well. You heard what you heard today. Rather interesting guest. Very informed, someone who I would encourage, especially since he's young enough to run this race, to get into the political melee again that he was once involved in. We didn't have enough time to be very candid with you to speak to full extent with all of these topics. These these conversations could be quite protracted because they're quite involved and they involve a lot of important information and facts that the public needs to know about. And I remind the public and our listeners, stop listening to the spoon-fed nonsense you're receiving from your media outlets. And that even applies to me. Do not take what I say to you as dogma. Go out and investigate for yourself. Find out the facts driving a lot of this discussion today. And above all things, please keep our children in the forefront of your mind every time you think of saying something or doing something. Think about how it will translate to them. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I look forward to speaking with you again next week. I'm Lou Palumbo. This has been Between the Lines.